nothing was working. I was trying to find something that worked that would make them shut up to stop hollering.
So you got a progressive kind of infliction of pain on these women.
I was trying to find something that would make them behave.
But it was painful to them.
I hope so. You know, that's what I was trying to achieve, you know, to make them behave.
Those eyes were like a poison deep in my mind. You're like the siren I couldn't fight. This time, I was trapped and waiting to die. All my life, I've been addicted to the wrong side. Every road I took,
So welcome to the podcast, the Strangeland podcast. This is a podcast for, everything, we can say strange, whether it be crime, murder, mysteries, that sort of thing. My name is Kenny. I'm going to be your co-host with my friend Stefan.
What's going on, everybody?
How are you doing tonight?
Doing great.
Just having a couple brewskis.
That's right.
This is the first episode, so, we'll see how it goes. We're starting tonight off with a really messed up guy. That's to say it,
At the very least.
At the very least.
That's actually pretty nice of you to say.
Yeah, he's super messed up. His name is Gary M. Heidnik. And Gary, who is also known as Brother Heidnik, because he actually started his own church, we'll get into that later. He was an American murderer. You could actually say serial killer, because he ended up killing 2. And, definition of serial killer, some people say it's 2 or more, some people say it's 3 or more, so it kind of just depends on if you consider him a serial killer. But he killed 2 women, and he actually kidnapped 6. And he kept them in his basement in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which is actually where Stefan's from, right?
Yeah, shout out to Philly. Good job, guys.
At least catching him. Well, this guy's not from Philadelphia, though. He was actually born in Eastlake, Ohio, which is a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. Do you want to go over exactly, give a brief summary on what he did?
Yeah, so definitely. So Heidnik actually targeted African-American women in their late teens to mid-20s. Usually abducted them by simply just bringing them over to his house, convinced them. So once he got them to his house, he then proceeded to drug them and attack them, typically after having sex with them. He also tortured his captives in many ways, including rape, beating, electric shock, starvation.
Yeah, and we should say that, at least to my knowledge, at least 2 out of the 6 victims that he had were prostitutes. At least 2. I mean, it could be more, actually. But, Josephine Rivera and Agnes Adams were definitely prostitutes. Do you want to go over just the list? I want to start off with the victims first, because we're going to spend most of this episode, I would say, talking about Gary Heidnik, and also his first victim, Josephine Rivera. She's, I would say, the key victim in this and in the entire story. But if you want to go ahead and go over all 6 of the victims.
Yeah, definitely. So here are the lists of the victims kidnapped in order here. So number 1, we have Josephine Rivera. So November 25th, 1986 was when she was captured by Heidnik. Next is Sandra Lindsay, which was December 3rd of 1986. We have Lisa Thomas, December 23rd, just 20 days later, 1986. Deborah Dudley, January 2nd, 1987. Jacqueline Askins, which is January 8th, 1987, and our final victim is Agnes Adams, which was on March 23rd. She was abducted.
And it should be noted that Agnes Adams, who, like Stefan just said, is was his last victim, and she was actually abducted the last day. She was abducted the day that he was caught. So the first 5, actually. I'm not saying that. I'm not trying to downplay what happened to Agnes Adams, but I'm just saying that she was abducted the day that he was caught. As Stefan said, this happened from the kidnapping started in November of 1986. They ended in March 1987. So just a good 5 months or so. And as we've already said, the things that he did to these poor women it's unreal. And I think, this is our first episode, so I wanted to start it off. With a bang, and also just get out how sick this guy was.
So before we talk to you more about what Gary Heidnik did, we're going to explain the man a little bit, sort of give you a breakdown of where he came from and his background, just to put everything into perspective. So Gary Heidnik was born on November 22nd, 1943 in Eastlake, Ohio, which is a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. His parents' names were Michael and Ellen Heidnik. He had a younger brother named Terry. His parents divorced in 1986, and the brothers lived with their mother for 4 years before being placed in the care of their father and his new wife. Heidnik would claim that he was emotionally abused by his father, suffering a long life problem of bedwetting, and claimed that his father would humiliate him by forcing him to hang his stained sheets from his bedroom window so all the neighbors could see.
Yeah, that's kind of ridiculous. I think coming from something like that is kind of easy to see. But I think a lot of times you kind of have to wonder, are these either serial killers or people that do really messed up stuff? Is it nature or is it nurture or what? And I think in Heidnik's case, and I would say in most cases it's a little bit of both, but he's definitely insane.
Yeah, I would say the first thing that comes to mind, honestly, is, imagine his father's life.
Yeah, exactly.
To be able to do that to your kid, you're already at a weird place in life, to say the least.
I don't really have much information on his father, except his father would later, when he was in trial, when Heidnik was in trial, his father would say that he was lying, that he didn't do anything, but of course he would,
Of course, yeah. Heidnik had a hard time in school and didn't interact with any of his fellow students, refused to make eye contact. When a new female student asked him if he had done his homework, he yelled and berated her, sort of a weird thing to do, very foretelling.
Yeah.
He was teased in school about his oddly shaped head, which him and his brother would claim as a result of falling out of a tree. And you can really see this when you see pictures of him.
Despite all of this, he did perform well. Obviously he was really smart. And he supposedly had a really high IQ. Now, if you Google search Gary Heidnik IQ, different things will come up. The one I found most commonly was 148. I did find one that said 160. Who knows? Anything over like 130 is kind of ridiculous, right? I think a genius is 138 or 140. So the dude was smart. And yeah, he was very intelligent. And at 14, he enrolled in Staunton Military Academy. And he was only there for 2 years. He left before he could graduate from that school. He then went to a public high school before he did drop out, and he joined the Army when he was 17 years old. Which, this guy joining the Army cannot have good results. But so he served in the Army for only 13 months, exactly. And during basic training, he did, his drill sergeant graded him as excellent. And following basic training, he applied for several specialist positions, including the military police. And of course, he was rejected. He was sent to San Antonio, Texas, to be trained as a medic, and did well throughout medical training, which is kind of creepy. But he did not stay in San Antonio for very long, and was transferred to the 46th Army Surgical Hospital, and I might butcher this, but Landstuhl, West Germany. And within weeks of his new posting in Germany, he earned his GED because, of course, like I said, he dropped out of high school.
In 1962, October, Heidnik was transferred to a military hospital in Philadelphia, where he was diagnosed with schizoid personality disorder and honorably discharged from the military service. Shortly after his discharge, Heidnik became a licensed practical nurse, and he had enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania, however dropped out after only one semester. He worked as a psychiatric nurse at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, which is where I am from.
Oh, wow.
Shout out to Coatesville. But was fired for poor attendance and rude behavior towards patients.
Yeah, that's very telling.
Yeah, if you ask me, he's just another person from Coatesville. Anyway, from...
We're going to get a lot of emails from... I mean, this is the first episode, so probably not, but...
Someone's mad out
Someone's
there.
mad.
I'm almost sure of it.
Sorry, people in Coatesville. Yeah, I mean, he started off as a psychiatric nurse, which is interesting, and then ended up spending time in and out of psychiatric hospitals. So this is interesting because, you know, of course, it said he was fired for poor attendance and rude behavior towards patients. And he would later, or actually before that, he was diagnosed with a schizophrenic disorder, schizoid personality disorder, and he would spend time in and out of psychiatric hospitals. This is interesting. And in 1970, his mother Ellen, who had been diagnosed with bone cancer, and who was also an alcoholic, committed suicide by drinking mercuric chloride. After his mother's suicide, that was when Gary started to attempt suicide. So remember we said he had attempted suicide 13 times between 1962 and 1987. And I would say really what that means is, you know, when his mother died in 1970, he started the attempts. And of course, you know, his kidnappings start around the time that, you know, he stopped trying to commit suicide. And his brother Terry also spent time in mental hospitals, and he also attempted suicide multiple times. And, you know, I couldn't really find much on Terry, but I think that's pretty telling. I mean, you know, something his father would also do. So we said that his dad would drape his pee-stained, this is awful, his pee-stained, you know, sheets out for everyone to see. He would also do things to torment them before they went to school, at school. So basically, he would paint targets on his kids' backs saying, you know, target me. He would do all these crazy things. So it seems like his dad was probably a piece of crap. And it seemed to also have affected Terry as well as Gary Heidnik. So both the brothers were affected by their father's brutality. So in October of 1971, he actually incorporated the United Church of the Ministers of God. And earlier, at the very beginning of the podcast, I said his name was Brother, you know, people called him Brother Heidnik. And he founded the Church of Heidnik. And it's ordained minister. And of course, like I said, where he took the name Brother Heidnik. He initially received $1,500 in a Merrill Lynch account. Now, he received this $1,500 basically through disability. He was on disability at this time. He received $1,500. I'm not sure over how long of a period, but I know he received it. He put it into a Merrill Lynch account, and the church would go on to make at least another $500,000. Which, you know, this is in the 70s into the 80s. You know, that's in today's money, and this is the beginning of 2018. That's over $1 million. I mean, so he has money. He has a crap ton of money just stashed away in his house. And in 1976, he actually sold the house he was living in, and he purchased a 3-story home and rented out 2 of the floors. And he moved into the house with his mentally disabled girlfriend, Anjanette Davidson, and he began living a, you know, fairly successful life.
In 1976, Heidnik was charged with aggravated assault and carrying an unlicensed pistol after assaulting one of the tenants of this house. In 1978, Gary had his first child, a daughter named Maxine, with his girlfriend and later abducted Anjanette's sister, Alberta, who was also mentally disabled, from an institution in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He was later charged and arrested with aggravated assault and then multiple charges of abduction and rape.
Yeah, and so this is kind of crazy because, you know, we've mentioned the first 6 victims. Well, Alberta is, you know, she came before the first 6. She's like a precursor to those, you know, and so maybe we should have said 7, but a very insensitive thing of me to say would be to say that Alberta was, and this is true, she was a trial and error because he got caught for Alberta. She got caught, or he got caught for Alberta. And, so I think maybe he kind of learned what to do and how to do it. And he was sentenced to 3 to 7 years. He was sentenced to 3 to 7 years for the crime, but he only served a couple. He was released in April of 1983. So actually, it looks like he served 5 years for the abduction and rape of Alberta Davidson.
In 1984, he purchases his third house and began advertising the church. In the following year, Gary married a mail-order bride by the name of Betsy Disto from the Philippines. However, the marriage was short after Disto found out that Heidnik had affairs with 3 other women, and in addition, he was also forced to watch his wife while she had sex with other women. Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
Insane.
Unbeknownst to Heidnik, until his ex-wife demanded child support, Disto had not given birth to his son, Jesse John Disto, after the divorce.
So yeah, I mean, so what might come up later is the fact that, this is what he says at least, he wanted to have kids. And the state took away his child that he had with Alberta Davidson, more than likely because they were both, mentally disabled. And he couldn't have his child with Disto, Betty Disto. She ended up moving back to the Philippines after all of this. And she took her son with her eventually. Before she did that, of course, she did ask for, child support, and that's how he found out about the child. But she didn't end up moving back to the Philippines, so he didn't have access to either one of his children. He said specifically, this was in trial, this was in investigations, that he wanted to have kids. And so, we're about to get into the actual abductions, but I want to say first that this is why this is what he says. This is why he wanted to abduct women. He wanted to have, let's say a baby factory with these women in his basement. He wanted to abduct these women and and rape them, and he wanted them to birth his children because he wanted to have babies. Now, how much you believe that is up to you. Who knows how true that is? That's what he says, and that's what he told his abductees as well. That he wanted to have babies, and he wanted to have their babies, and he wanted to keep the women and the babies as slaves. That's how that happened. It's really messed up, but
Yeah, he wanted to grow his flock, his budding church, all of his women.
And I'm sure he would have treated his children, better than his dad treated him. And if you can't hear the sarcasm in my voice, it was there. So you want to go ahead and go into the abductions?
Sure. So on November 25th, 1986, Gary picked up Josephine Rivera, who was an African-American prostitute, took her to her house. After having sex, he choked her into unconsciousness before chaining her up in his basement. Gary then dug a pit in the basement floor. He put Josephine into this little hole he had sort of carved out of the basement floor, which could be covered by a weighted board if Josephine tried to escape or if she, misbehaved.
Yeah, and Josephine is the main abductee. Not only because she was the first abductee, but because she gained his trust. And we'll talk more about that later. But she gained his trust, and she became his favorite. And again, you'll see why later. She became his favorite. And she was the first one. And about the pit, we haven't said this, but Gary was the inspiration for Buffalo Bill, the Buffalo Bill character from Silence of the Lambs. This pit was not that big. This pit, if you listen to interviews from Josephine Rivera, it wouldn't fit her. She was like cramped and shoved down in there. It would not fit. It was a very tiny pit. So.
She also suffered from asthma, which made it just much worse.
Man, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I didn't read that.
Yeah.
Geez, that sucks. I mean, yeah. I did listen to some interviews with her, and she said that this pit was just really small. As she was screaming to be let out because she couldn't breathe. So.
It seems to be his first victim is actually the most special in some sort of weird way. Like, meaning the way he treated her, she was somehow, he treated them differently than the other women.
So on December 1986, Gary abducted the mentally disabled Sandra Lindsay, whom he had actually gotten pregnant before, but she had an abortion, which had angered him. And how Gary met Sandra Lindsay... Gary met Sandra Lindsay and her mom because they were actually, the church we mentioned earlier, the church that he had founded. They were members of the church, so she had been to his house before. She had been there for church meetings. Her mom had been inside the house. So when he brought her home, she wasn't a prostitute. He brought her home because they knew each other. And I guess, Gary actually took Sandra out to dinner, out to movies, out that sort of thing, to try to just basically regular dates, and eventually brought her back to his house. And he brought her into the basement. And for the first month, almost the first month, Sandra and Josephine Rivera, they were the only two women in that basement. So you can imagine that they sort of bonded. They became friends. They were the first two. So.
On December 23rd, he brought 19-year-old Lisa Thomas over to his home, drugged her with wine, and then put her in the basement with the other women.
Yeah, there's not a ton that I can say about Lisa Thomas, although we know that she was compliant. But other than that, I can't really find a ton about her.
Right, and you got to also know the restraints that this guy used. He would basically use clamps to clamp their arm and legs together, seal them with crazy glue, and chain them up, essentially, like animal.
Oh, yeah. He would super glue the nuts. But we should say real fast that this didn't necessarily work in the beginning, because before Gary abducted Sandra Lindsay, Josephine Rivera actually escaped. Slightly. Almost escaped. We'll say almost escaped. She didn't actually escape. She made it out of the basement window. And because I guess one of the nuts on one of her chains got loose. So she was still chained up, but she was able to get out the window, and she was yelling for help in the neighborhood. And no one heard her, and he got home too fast. Drug her back down to the basement. Redid the clamps, redid the glue to make sure it was tighter, probably put her in the pit. And so, she was this close to getting out. But unfortunately, no one heard her screaming.
Yeah, no one was the wiser for that experience. So, January 2nd, 1987, now well over a month since the first abduction of Josephine Rivera, he abducted Deborah Dudley. During her period of captivity, she was much more defensive against Gary and would try more attempts to escape, which led him to beat her more often than the others, making her essentially a punching bag for his psychopathic tendencies.
Oh, yeah.
He also put her into the pit much more often. Gary kept these 4 women for almost 3 weeks before he would abduct another. I mean, just think of the things that were happening in this basement.
Yeah, I can't imagine. Honestly, can't imagine. That's 4 weeks. Josephine Rivera, Josephine Rivera was there for almost 5 months, maybe even, right around 5 months. Yeah, I can't imagine. It's insane.
I mean, it's hard to think that people wouldn't catch on to this, but this guy was playing his TV turned all the way up, all of his radios in the house, loud and blaring, and everyone just thought he was maybe a little eccentric. And
everyone knew he was insane. Yeah, everyone knew he was insane, so he kept his stuff up loud. That's not a crazy thing to do for a mentally disabled person. you know. But like Stephen said, Deborah Dudley, I really want to fixate on that for a second because she did not give in, and she did not, she really rebelled against him. And like we said earlier, Josephine Rivera, she was very compliant with Gary. And like I said, I think that's smart, but you kind of have to give something to Deborah Dudley for sticking up for herself. She wasn't going to take it. She wasn't going to take it without fighting. And so I think that's something kind of have to, a lot of people could say that that's dumb, but, what do you do in that? Neither one of us have ever been in that position.
Right.
Hopefully we never are. Most people won't ever be in anything even close to that position. So what do you do? And she was very strong, and, she was very, very strong. So that's what I have to say about her. I think it should be noted that she did not just give up.
Yeah, definitely. And, to think about the living conditions of these girls in general is terrifying.
Yeah.
So not only was he starving them, they would be fed dog food, being beaten on the regular. So these girls weren't. It wasn't just a normal basement. It was sort of a torture chamber.
It was a torture chamber. I mean, so that's what it was. Yeah, and so on January 18th, 1987, he abducted Jacqueline Askins. And so, she is now the fourth victim. So let's recap real quick. He's already abducted Josephine Rivera. About a week and a half later, he abducted Sandra Lindsay. And then about 3 weeks after that, Lindsay Thomas. So the fourth victim... then we have Deborah Dudley, who was the fourth victim, actually. I'm sorry. The fifth victim is Jacqueline Askins, again, on January 18th, 1987. So she is the fifth victim. And again, for her, she made it out, and she was pretty compliant. She didn't really fight him too much. And we should go on to Sandra Lindsay's death. Now, Sandra Lindsay, as far as we know, is Gary's first murder. This is when he actually first murdered somebody. So on February 7th, Gary became angry with Sandra Lindsay. And supposedly, Sandra Lindsay, she didn't want to eat anymore. She was depressed, which makes complete sense. She was done with everything. And, from listening to interviews with Josephine Rivera, Sandra Lindsay had something wrong with her jaw. It's, she didn't go into great detail about it. But it should be, stated again that Sandra Lindsay had mental issues. She was mentally disabled. I mean, and we could say that this is why Gary did that. He fed on the mentally disabled. That's what he did.
He preyed on the weak. He
preyed on the weak. And so again, on February 7th, Gary became angry with Sandra Lindsay, and she was his first murder. And basically, he wanted to punish her for not wanting to eat. And remember, he's feeding them dog food. He's feeding them dog food. So Gary punished her by hanging her by her wrist from a roof beam for 2 days. And she developed a high fever, and she would die on the third day. Now, it's said that she died probably from suffocation, but no one really knows because of what he did with her body. But it's said that the way she hung, when she was too exhausted, she fell on herself and her body fell on her lungs. It's a very unfortunate death, and so that was his first murder.
So after he had realized she was dead, he actually took her upstairs, dismembered her with a power saw, and put her head into a cooking pot and cut out her flesh. He had fed some parts to his 2 dogs, and then actually force-fed the girls downstairs the remains of her body. A couple days later, actually, the neighbors complained of the terrible smell reeking from the house. And when 2 cops were sent to investigate, Gary told them he had just burnt a pork roast and no need for concern. The cops actually bought this.
Well, what do? So they don't have a warrant. They're not going to go check. And at this point, they don't know that anyone's missing. They just don't know. They do find out that Sandra Lindsay is missing. But I believe at this point they don't know. So what do? He comes to the door and he tells them that he burnt a roast. And who doesn't burn roasts from time to time? And the cops can't just go in the house legally. So, I don't know if the cops necessarily did a bad thing. They were kind of just working with what they had. But, they probably should have investigated a little bit further.
Yeah, definitely. And, yeah, I mean, and he was all, like we said earlier, he was known for playing his music loud. This wasn't the first time the cops had been over here.
Yeah, and
I feel
also,
like at this part, they were starting to maybe have an inkling that maybe something was
exactly. And
awry.
when they came this time, his music was blaring, his TV was blaring. And so that was the thing. Now, I will say one thing real fast. Let me get into this. This is pretty interesting. I don't know if this happened before or after this, but the cops were called on Gary, basically by Sandra Lindsay's sister and mother, because she was missing, and they thought maybe he had done it. Well, so they went to the house to talk to him, and they can't do anything. They don't have proof that a crime was committed. They don't have that much evidence that she's there. And by the way, I do believe this was before the cops came for the smell. So maybe a little telling. But again, so they came, and a few days after the cops visited with him, Sandra Lindsay's mother received a letter in the mail addressed from New York with Sandra's fingerprints on it and Sandra's handwriting saying that she had ran away to New York and to not worry about her anymore. And then this is kind of weird, I think, at the end of the note, at the end of the letter, there was a signature, which, I mean, I guess that makes sense, but there was no like love Sandra, there was no anything like that. It was just a signature. And it was her signature. So this is kind of smart. This shows that Gary is smart. He's not dumb. He might be mentally disabled, but he's very smart.
It's really smart, and his IQ starts to actually peek through right here.
Exactly. And so this, as I feel like, as suspicious as it is to her mother and to her sister, to the cops who don't have any emotional attachment to anything, they look at this as evidence that Sandra Lindsay is in New York, that they're not. So he fooled the cops very, very simply right there.
So Heidnik actually bribed his captives into telling on one another about their various plans to escape. This guy was actually sadistic enough to turn all the girls against each other, even despite their situation. That way he could gain information about, what they were thinking and what was going on within the subcircle of the girls downstairs. Josephine Rivera actually told him that one of the others had planned to attack him and try and get out. As a result, he made them deaf by driving a screwdriver through their eardrums. This would also help the girls calm down and not yell as different people came to the door, as to not give away that they were downstairs being hidden.
Yeah, and he started to apply electrocution to all of his captives as well, except for Rivera. So it kind of comes into play, showing that Rivera was the favorite. And he started to aid him in the torturing of the others. Now, this sucks. I can't imagine being in Rivera's spot. She's still a slave. She's still Gary's slave. And she's being kept in the basement, but she's the favorite. So all the other girls hate her. They don't like her because she's not torturing the other girls with him. It's insane.
Yeah, it is true. She had privileges. Definitely his favorite, you know. Occasionally, she was even allowed to go upstairs and watch a movie. Or she was allowed to be raped in a more comfortable environment. So, as sick and twisted as this guy was, he sort of did have this weird, twisted soft spot in his heart for Josephine Rivera.
Allowed to be raped in a more comfortable environment. That is insane. That was the privilege that she got for being his favorite, by the way. So even the favorite you can think of, she still was raped in a more quote unquote more comfortable environment, as he would say. So that's insane.
Yeah.
So I think we should talk more about his second and last murder. You know, according to us, he killed two people in his life, which was Sandra Lindsay and Deborah Dudley. And so Stefan mentioned the electrocution. He started to electrocute his captives, and this is how he killed Deborah Dudley. He technically, you know, we could say it was Gary and Josephine Rivera because he forced her to help kill Dudley. The pit that was in the basement that we talked about, the pit that he made everyone go down into, they filled it with water. Now, it wasn't completely full of water. It was maybe 2 or 3 inches of water, but he made Deborah Dudley sit or lay in the pit and electrocuted her until she was dead. Now, we said before that Deborah Dudley, she rebelled. She did not just take it sitting. She did not take it quietly. She rebelled against Gary. And Gary's not the kind of person. He started his own church. In his eyes, he should be treated like a god to these women, and she's not doing that. She's rebelling. She's not treating him like a god. So he kills her. Now, he says that he didn't mean to kill her. Well, he actually never says he killed her, but he says he just electrocuted her. So we can say that maybe he didn't mean to kill her. Maybe he was just torturing her to try to get her to quiet down, but he did end up killing her. And he actually got Rivera to help dispose of her body. So that's how much he trusted Rivera. He took her out with him to dispose of the body.
So the death of Deborah Dudley is actually really important here. Once she's fatally electrocuted in the sort of watery grave they made for her in his basement, he takes Josephine Rivera in his car. They put the body of Deborah Dudley into the trunk, drive out to an edge of a forest, and dump her body. And because of this, because of the trust Josephine had gained with Brother Heidnik, he actually lets her, as a privilege, go and see her family. And the moment she's dropped off on her street, she actually runs a block over, notifying the police immediately, which is basically the downfall of Gary Heidnik and his masquerade.
Yeah, so, we have to think about how, like you said, Rivera, Gary's very trusting of Rivera at this point. And how must she be feeling to be out there disposing of Deborah Dudley's body? And I think one thing should be said before they went out, to this forest and dumped Deborah Dudley's body and dug up a hole and put her down. He made Josephine Rivera sign a note that he had written up saying that Rivera helped Gary kill Deborah Dudley. There's a note that she signed saying this. And he tried to use this as leverage, saying, I'm going to take you out. You're going to help me with this. But if you escape, I'm going to show this note to the police. To my knowledge, this note has never been found. This is just what Josephine Rivera says. She said that he made her sign this note. So it was supposed to be used as leverage. it obviously didn't work. And like Stefan said, she gained his trust that when he told her, we have to go find a replacement for Deborah Dudley, she said, yeah, I'll do this, but I haven't seen my family in 5 months. Let me go see my family. And the moment that he lets her go, she runs to a gas station, like Stefan said, a block over, and calls the cops. And that has to explain that for the last 5 months, she's been a captive of his with 5 other women, or 4 other women, really. And then, one that was about to be a captive, Agnes Adams. And they don't believe her at first. They're thinking like, well, who is this crazy person calling? And she made it clear that this is real. And so they came, they found her, and they actually, she showed the cops where Gary was parked, and they went, guns drawn, brought him out of the car, and then went back to the house and freed the other women. And the other women were, of course, ecstatic. They found Lisa Thomas in the pit. They found Jacqueline Askins just out and about, and so they were hugging. I'm sure they were super happy to be free. I mean, and just to see the faces of cops in the basement, it was just, they, for all they knew, two women have already died. For all they knew, they were going to die too. So.
Yeah, one of the cops actually said when he walked into the basement, they were hysterical cries of joy.
Yeah, I can imagine. You're being freed,
During his trial, Heidnik repeatedly denied all allegations of mistreatment of his captains, and he claimed that Sandra Lindsay had been killed by the other captives for being a lesbian. He also mentioned, which is kind of interesting, that the girls were actually in the basement when he moved in the house, as if somehow that is bypassing the wrongness of his act.
Yeah, it's okay. They were there, so I'm just going to torture these. That I think is one of the most insane things that is in this entire case. They were there. I'm just going to torture them.
Yeah, so it was okay. I figured they came with the house. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Before his execution, Heidnik reportedly claimed that he wanted to be executed because the execution of an innocent man would stop the death penalty in America. Needless to say, he didn't make his case very well. At the trial, Heidnik was defended by A. Charles Perito Jr., who attempted to prove that Heidnik was legally insane, which is probably the smartest way to go.
Yeah, you think it would be, but while I think he is insane, he's not. He's really smart. He's insane. He has mental issues. He's mentally disabled, but he is very smart. And that's proven by the fact that he amassed, again, $550,000 in his banks and his brokerage accounts. And that was used to argue that he was not insane. And even testimony from his Merrill Lynch financial advisor, Robert Kirkpatrick, was used to prove competence. Because think about it, if you're incompetent, I honestly cannot imagine. I'm not very smart, but I'm not dumb. There's no way I'm starting a church and getting $1 million in today's. That was how much he had in today's money.
Right.
There's no way I'm starting a church and getting $1 million. This is not happening. So the dude was smart. And
yeah, this isn't an average crazy person off of the street. It's a cold, calculated, thought out plan. Kirkpatrick called Heidnik an astute investor who knew exactly what he was doing. Convicted of 2 accounts of first-degree murder on July 1st, 1988, Heidnik was sentenced to death and incarcerated at the State Correctional Institution of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In January 1989, he attempted suicide with an overdose of prescribed Thorazine. In 1997, Heidnik's daughter, Maxine Davidson White, and his ex-wife, Betty Heidnik, filed suit in federal court in Eastern District of Pennsylvania, seeking a stay of execution on the basis that Heidnik was not, in fact, competent to be executed.
Which has already been disproved. We've already found him to be competent. But, of course, again, based on his church and the money that he amassed. So, So, yeah, I mean, again, that's disproved after 2 years of legal proceedings in various courts. On July 3rd, 1999, the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania issued its final ruling clearing the way for Heidnik's execution.
Yeah, Heidnik was actually executed by lethal injection July 6th, 1999, at a state correctional facility in Rockview Center County, Pennsylvania.
Which is crazy. Let me jump in. So I said he was found, they cleared the way for Heidnik's execution on July 3rd, 1999. He was executed on July 6th, 1999. It's 3 days. That never happens. People sit on death row. Now he did sit on death row for a decade, or a little bit over a decade. But there were a lot of appeals, like you said, done by his ex-wife and his daughter. And it's usually like if those appeals are thrown out and it's ruled that he can be executed, it usually doesn't take 3 days. It usually takes another few years. So it's kind of crazy that 3 days later they killed him. But it's awesome. Don't get me wrong. But
yeah, they weren't wasting any time for sure.
No.
So 1999, Heidnik's body was cremated, and as of 2017, he's the last person to be executed by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I think one thing I want to go back on is, so we said that he said that the girls were in the basement when he moved into this house. That's insane as it is. And then he also said he never confessed to the murders. He always claimed his innocence to the murders. Now you can find on YouTube, and if you Google search, you can find interviews with him stating on how he did torture them. He had to keep them. He had to torture them so they would behave. But he never admits to killing anybody. And they never, to my knowledge, they never found any evidence, body evidence. They didn't have bodies for the two women because he cut up Sandra Lindsay and he buried Deborah Dudley. So he never admitted guilt. He claimed innocence for murders. And like Stefan said, he claimed innocence so much that he said he was okay with dying. He was okay with being killed by the state. But if an innocent man was killed by the state, it would send a message to the state. I think that is absolutely mind-boggling. How that's even possible. I think that's an admission of guilt in and of itself. I think him saying that he's okay with being killed by the state because if they kill an innocent man, it will send a message. That's insane. I think that's an admission of guilt. I think that's him saying, yeah, I did it, kill me.
Yeah, I don't think he convinced anyone of that by making that statement. It was blatantly clear and obvious. The evidence was quite stacked against him in here. He knew it. Everyone knew it.
And he was killed. So, yeah, and that's the end of this episode. Gary M. Heidnik, brother Heidnik, was absolutely insane. This was a pretty clear and cut case about someone who was egotistical, who thought of himself as a god, who, he abducted these women, he tortured them, he killed two of them. He was just an insane person. And this, again, this was pretty clear and cut. He was killed by the state of Pennsylvania in the end. Oh, and also, this is episode 1. Next episode is going to be Casey Anthony. That is an insane story. So yeah, come back for that because I'm probably going to get pretty into that episode. I'm real passionate about that case, about Casey's case. I want to go into it right now. I just want to start talking about it right now. I mean, seriously, it's insane. I love it. I mean, it's awful. I say I love it, it's awful, but it's really it's going to be a really good one. So check it out.
Thanks, guys.
Now I'm reading your